Mhm. Okay, just a second here. Let's start. Okay, so I would also like to welcome some of the folks from the Humboldt County or the Humboldt State beginning beekeeping class. Some of this stuff we're going to be talking about tonight is going to seem a little bit deep and over your head, but don't get too intimidated or scared. Sort of take it in and then read about it, learn about it. It's something you'll need to know later on. Also, thank you, Wendy, for pitching the California Master Beekeeping program. I think the folks that did it last year are a good resource also. If you're curious, call them and see if they'll see what they have to say about it. So you're not just hearing from the managers and the instructors. So I'm going to be talking about division, splits, nukes, and increase. So what the hell does that mean when you hear it? You hear it all the time. And these words mean something different to everybody. So we're going to talk about that in a moment. But this subject is somewhat timely for a couple of reasons. One, when you think that we lose about 40% of our colonies every winter, there needs to be a way to replenish those. And so what I would hope people would do with some of this information is maybe make a few splits with the intention of replacing your losses, your winter losses. And so by propagating your hives, you can do that. It's also kind of timely because we're going to get into, let's see how this is going to work. We're going to get into swarm season, and probably the most definitive way of stopping the progression of swarming is to make a divide or a split of that colony. In some manner, weaken that parent colony so it goes off the swarm instinct. So as a kind of an outline, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those definitions and some of the terminology. And I've been asked to talk about swarming as well. And it's really a subject that should be discussed all by itself, but you can't really talk about splits and divides and making them nucleus colonies without talking a little bit about swarming, especially queens. I want to talk a little bit about some relevant honeybee biology. I think beekeepers tend to gloss over some of the most basic of biology and honeybee behavior, and they don't really understand what their colonies are doing. If they just understood a little bit more about timing of the life cycle of a honeybee or a colony, they'd be able to make better decisions and maybe have fewer problems. Then we'll kind of transition into the why, the whens, and the hows, and a couple of examples, and then we'll take any questions. Before I start, are there any questions? Okay, so these are kind of the terms you see all the time when you're looking at this subject. And so you often hear about making increase colonies, or what's a balanced colony? We want to have a balanced colony when we're all finished. Or what's a split and what's a divide, or are they the same? And what's a nucleus colony? What does it exactly mean when Janice tells me she's going to hoop on, she's going to make up some nukes or nucks or whatever she wants to call them? And what kind of boxes do you use for these? What's the equipment that you might be looking at? Then in the course of discussing terminology, that's where I'm going to touch on swarms and swarming, and maybe a little bit about artificial swarms. So an increase, just at the most basic and simple level, it's just an increase in the number of colonies. You go from 1 to 2 or 4 or 6 or whatever you want to do. And it doesn't have to be with a split, right? So when somebody's talking about increase, I don't necessarily know what they're talking about. I have an idea. I know what the basic concept is, but it's like somebody putting a big piece of, or a big apple pie in front of you and says, do you want a piece of pie? Yeah. And they give you half the pie. Well, that may not be what you were thinking about. Maybe you're thinking about something smaller. So it's kind of a relative term.
You're talking about.
So there's different ways that increase can be accomplished. Simply collecting swarms is a means of increase. And it's a good way of increase. It's cheap. but they're not always available. Dividing and splitting colonies is something we all can do. If we have any colonies at all, we can take one colony and make multiple colonies. We can accomplish increase by making nucleus colonies, which is another form of splitting or dividing. And we can buy bee packages. We can buy nucleus colonies. Those all meet the definition of an increase. When we do splits and do divides, if we have a colony at all, we want it to be a balanced colony. And effectively, what it means is that in that colony, there's the appropriate age of bees, the appropriate mix of cast members, that's females, so queens and workers and drones, and they have adequate resources for whatever that time of season is. So maybe in a couple months, they're going to be loaded with certain resources, whereas coming out of winter, not so much, but it may be very adequate for the time of year. And a balanced colony, doesn't matter what size the colony is, it still has to meet certain requirements if it's going to be successful and thrive. And one of the things we always worry about after a swarm, and the queens left and half the colonies left, is we worry about that colony coming back into balance, developing another queen, growing the brood, and ultimately that's going to be our goal when we do any kind of splitting or dividing or making up nucleus colonies. So splits and divides are basically the same thing. Okay, they can be used interchangeably. Often it's the simplest type of split is just taking a double-bodied hive and separating the boxes, providing the queen to the queenless half, and off you go. And I'll show you that in a second. Nucleus colonies are another kind of divide or a split. Okay, they're basically a balanced colony that's very small. Usually, it doesn't have to be real small. The size doesn't have anything to do with the criteria to be called a nuke. It's just another type of split or divide. When we talk about nucleus colonies, this is what we probably think about. Of everybody that's attending this meeting tonight, I said, describe a nucleus colony. This is what you'd probably describe in one form or another. It could be a wood box. It could be that plastic, whatever you call it, cardboard nuke box. But it's a balanced little colony. It usually has a queen, has an adequate supply of bees and nurse bees and pollen and nectar, and so it can thrive. But it doesn't have to be one of these. Every one of these boxes you see here, or hives, if you will, is a nucleus colony. You can make a nucleus colony out of one or two frames, or 4 frames, or 5 frames, or 8 frames across the board. So it really doesn't matter what size box. Any box that you can imagine can be used as a nucleus colony. These are mini nukes. These are used for rearing queens until they're flying and mating, and then they can be taken out and used either in another colony or sold or whatever you want to do with them. Here's a double nuke. The idea here is you can kind of share the heat or warmth that the different colonies on each side are producing. Yeah, basically in the middle have a, I'm going to try to find my pointer here. So in the middle here, you have a thin piece of plywood or luan, goes all the way to the top of the box, down to the floor. You have a solid floor that's nailed on the box. You put one colony here, one colony on the other side. So you basically have 2 colonies growing in one box. Each colony has its own entrance. You let this grow. You can add on supers on top of each one of these, and you just keep growing and growing and growing. This is the nuke that I tend to use sometimes. Okay, it's an 8-frame box. I have follower boards on each side, and I have 5 frames in there. Okay, I have empty space over here. That's okay. Follower boards reduce the volume and basically create a 5-frame nuke. And this is housed on top of a regular colony. And in this case, Well, let me back up. This is the same configuration, except I pushed it all over to one side, just use one follower board. Again, I'm reducing the volume of the box, but I still have a 5-frame nuke. The 5-frame nuke is in an 8-frame box. I have it set on a Snellgrove board, and this is the door. Okay, so I can close the door. Snellgrove boards have multiple doors. I can open other doors if I want to accomplish different things. It's a real simple, easy way to make a nuke. It doesn't require a lot of equipment, and anybody can do this. This is a Snellgrove board, the different entrances. Separated the lower colony from the upper colony. So anything can be a nuke box. So let's start a little bit about swarming and swarms now. So there's basically 3 different kinds of swarms that honeybee colonies will generate. The one we're beginning to look at this time of year is a reproductive swarm. Okay, these are the ones we all fear. They come along just prior to peak nectar flow. They're innate. Okay, the honeybees, in a sense, don't even maybe understand why they're doing it, but it's an innate process, and the idea is to spread their genetics throughout the countryside. Okay, it's related to crowding, and the process is similar to a congestion swarm, but what triggers them is really different. A congestion swarm usually comes later in the year. It's not for reproductive purposes. It's just to minimize the congestion. So these are the swarms you see later on in the year. Both of these types of swarms generate queen cells or swarm cells. Spawning swarms are completely different. They just the whole colony flies away like you'd see in a reproductive swarm, except they don't leave any queen cells behind. They're just boom, gone. So here's the question for you all. Does swarming equal swarms? Is swarming the same as a swarm? What do you think, Hank? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Why are you asking me?
Well, you can reach out. You can have a lifeline and ask somebody else to help you.
Does swarming equal a swarm?
Is swarming the same as a swarm? Take a wild guess. You got 50% chance you'll get it right.
No.
Why? All right, I'm going to let you off the hook. No, they're not. There's a difference. But what's the difference? So if you look at a definition of what swarming is, according to Dewey Karen, he would tell you that swarming is the process of swarming or preparing to swarm. Okay, so this is the buildup before the bees all take off. All right, right now our bees are probably swarming. We've already heard people that we're seeing drones. What other things do you tend to see in a colony that's getting prepared to swarm? You're going to see white wax. You're going to see backfilling. You're going to see increase in congestion, increase in brood, increase in adult bees. You're going to see a lot of different things. And then ultimately, if they get far enough and if they're healthy enough, they probably will leave. But remember this, only strong colonies swarm. Only strong colonies swarm. So if you don't have colonies that are doing any of these things that you would expect to see in a colony that's ready to swarm, you might ask yourself why. It's a weaker colony. Something's wrong. Maybe it needs to be requeened. But they have to be strong enough and healthy enough to swarm. So these are the kind of things you see. Now this is a I wouldn't call this brooding, but this is an example where this colony is getting so big and has so many bees, they're filling up the brood nest, they're filling up the supers, they're flowing out of the hive. When you start to see something like this happening every day in a colony, you're going to start to ask yourself, well, isn't this one that might be one we need to watch because it could be getting ready to swarm? If you open your box, and almost immediately, this is what the top of the frames look like. This is a big, strong colony. This is the kind of colony you would expect to give you some trouble with swarming. The other thing you're going to see is white wax. They start to deposit white wax on the top bars, on the underneath of the inner cover. That's a sign. Another sign is they'll start to build a lot of queen cups. Now, in and of itself, a queen cup isn't an indicator that a colony is going to swarm, but and some races produce a lot of queen cups. But until you see something in those cups, like this one, where you have an egg, you don't need to worry. As soon as you see eggs showing up in queen cups, that's kind of the trigger point. Once they reach that point, you can be pretty sure they're going to get ready to swarm. How many days do you have by the time you see eggs in a queen cup before they swarm? Mary, you want to take a crack at that one? I'll give you.
Your queen is leaving. You got 18 days for your queen to emerge from after being laid, but then another 7 days for a new queen to mature enough.
No, I think you didn't hear my question right. From the time you see an egg deposited in a queen cup, which is now called a queen cell because it has an egg in it, how many days do you have before you're likely to see a swarm?
Oh.
I'll give you a
Do they
clue.
swarm? I actually forget this. I need to go look this up because I can't recall if it's as soon as they have a capped queen.
Okay, that's good. So usually colonies will swarm on the day that a queen cell is capped. And queen cells typically cap on the 8th day. Okay. So that's what I was getting after. So once you see this, you have 7 days to make some pretty fast decisions on what you're going to do, or your colonies are likely to swarm. If you reach this point, it's game over. Okay. Yeah. These are cap cells. By now, when you see this, usually the colony has swarmed. Okay. At this point, there's not much you can do other than try to manage this the best you can. You're calling some queen cells and trying to coalesce the colony back into a reasonably balanced position, but you won't know what that is until you have a new queen and you have eggs in brood. So this is what I was referring to. They typically cast when the cells are capped, but that doesn't mean they always do that. So you should still go through and inventory your colony for population. Perhaps you'll locate the queen. If you can find the queen at that point, then you have some wiggle room. You know, you can make a split and save that colony or most of that colony. So all of that was swarming, right? They're building up to the swarm. The swarm is actually the cluster you see hanging on the tree, or all those bees buzzing around up in the sky. By then, it's too late. So this is too late. This is too late. This is the end of swarming, okay? Not the beginning of swarming. A lot of people refer to this as, oh, my bees are swarming. No, they're done swarmed. They're over with. They're on to something else. I would venture to say for the next few weeks, all of our colonies are probably swarming. Some of them won't be strong enough to get there. Others will get there sooner, some a little bit later. Typically speaking, swarming tends to occur before peak nectar flow evolutionarily. If you think about that, it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't make sense to have all your bees swarming and out and gone out and collecting things after the nectar flow. So they try to do things before. So once they're in their new colonies, they can build that colony up. All right, that's kind of my swarms and swarming. There's a lot more you could cover about that. Does anybody have any questions to this point? All right, you guys got it all. So let's talk a little bit about biology and behavior of honeybees. You know, I've often felt, like I said, I don't think most people understand just some of the basic biology and science and behavior that honeybees go through. And if they did, it'd probably be a little bit easier time for them in terms of beekeeping. So we want to first kind of look at the bee math, which is it's pretty simple stuff, but it's overlooked. It's one of the first things you ever see in a beekeeping book like Beekeeping for Dummies. Most people that are into beekeeping or getting into it, they want to get to the meat and potatoes of stuff, you know, but bee math isn't too important. So this is a chart you see in a lot of beekeeping books, and it's kind of important. It tells you a lot of things. First off, all these different bees, the female cast, the queen, and the workers, and the drone, all start as an egg. And they're all an egg for about 3 days. And then they transition into a larva. The queen, okay, we just asked Mary this question, when does this cell cap? And it caps typically on day 8. Okay, she's going to hatch out on day 16, but she's not ready for prime time at that point. It's going to take her 4 or 5 up to 7 days to mature before she goes out and does some mating flights. She's going to do a few mating flights, maybe over a couple days, and then it's going to take her maybe another week before she's laying. So it could take as many as 30 days for a new queen to start laying any eggs. Then it's going to take another at least 21 days. So you're up to about 51 days now before you see any emerge. That's pushing 2 months. The reason that's important, and the reason you need to understand that, is when you're making splits and divides or nucleus colonies or whatever you want to call them, and you're not giving them a queen, you're relying on them to raise a queen, you need to factor that in, okay? There's other things to consider as well, and we'll talk about them, but timing is pretty critical. We talked about that. Why are we going backwards? So all colonies need a queen. It doesn't matter if it's a full-size colony, if it's a little tiny colony, a little tiny nucleus colony, a medium-sized colony. Everybody needs a queen. If they don't have a queen, the colony starts to lay drones. You'll have workers that'll start laying drones, and that leads to the demise of the colony because pretty soon you don't have any workers bringing in any sort of nectar or pollen. You can't produce more brood, and without a queen, you're in trouble. So queens are real critical when you're making up splits, and you need to know if you're going to give them a mated queen, which is always going to be the best option, or you're going to try to give them a queen cell, which is probably the second best option, and or let them make a queen, which is probably the worst option, but it's a doable option. Colonies are going to raise a queen anytime they have a need, but they can't do it without the resources. So what are some of the needs? Basically, the 3 needs are, they'll raise a queen for swarm purposes, whether it's a reproductive swarm or a congestion type swarm. They'll raise a queen in supersedure situations. They'll raise a queen in emergency situations. Supersedure and emergency queens are raised from worker brood. Okay, they try to pick the youngest larvae they can and then draw out a cell and raise a queen. Okay, supersedure occurs when you've had a queen that's been damaged or ill or starting to fail. And the colony recognizes that, and so they move to replace her. An emergency queen is a queen that's raised due to a sort of an acute failure. Something has happened. There's an immediate loss of queen pheromone. The bees know that within minutes to an hour, and they immediately start to make emergency queens. As long as they have young enough larvae to choose from that can make a pretty good queen. Some people argue they can make as good a queen as a grafted queen. Others argue that they're scrub queens. They're not very good. Swarm cells, swarm queens are raised out of swarm cells or queen cells. They're designed specifically for raising queens. What do you need in the way of resources? Well, you need a very young larvae, 12 to 24 hours old. Anything older than that, the quality of the queen starts to decline. They need proteins, which they get from pollen, and they need carbohydrates from nectars. They need a big population of nurse bees. Why? Nurse bees are the ones that feed the royal jelly. They're the ones that feed the developing larvae. And care for that larvae until it's capped. The question becomes then, should you let your colonies raise their own queens, especially if you're making small nucleus-sized colonies, or should you provide them? Remember, larger colonies, stronger colonies, have more nurse bees, they raise better queens in general. Smaller colonies don't have the nurse bee population, therefore the royal jelly is going to be less. Maybe the quality of it's going to be less. And so you may have an inferior queen that's going to be superseded as soon as the colony gets larger. So this is what I just told you. If you're going to raise a queen, you need very young brood, you need to have the resources, and you need young bees. And if you're raising them in a nuke, you might be adding young bees in the form of shaking young bees from other colonies or other frames from the colony you're splitting from. So let's kind of make some divides and splits. So why do we want to even think about doing this? Well, at this time of year, we're thinking swarm prevention. So we're thinking if we take a colony that's inclined to swarm and we don't do something to weaken that colony or dissuade them from swarming, our bees are going to fly off and be in the neighbor's trees. Okay. Splits allow you to make some brood breaks. I don't know if it's the best reason to make a split, but certainly you can delay any brood growth to the point that we just told you. You could have 50 days where before you have new brood emerging, and therefore all of the varroa are phoretic. We talked about that earlier when we were trying to decide what kind of miticides to use. So there's some opportunities there. Certainly to make increase, all right? In other words, make more colonies. It's a real easy way to do it. Making splits and divides, as complicated as you might think it is pretty darn simple. You can use them for resource colonies. There's nothing in a nucleus colony that couldn't be used in a big colony if you needed it. Okay, you can pull the queen out and put it in a situation where you're suddenly queenless. You can pull brood out. You can pull other resources out. So as a resource colony, everybody should have one or two little nucleus colonies going all the time. They're a great place to raise some queens. Okay, I said earlier, you don't really want to let the colonies raise their own queens because they could be inferior, but you could raise some queens, put some queen cells in there, and they'll basically incubate them until they mature. You can use them for mating nukes. I showed you those little tiny nukes at the start. You can use them for queen banks. You can put a couple of queens on a special holder inside there, and you have a dandy little queen bank. And you can use them for improving the genetics of your colony. You can pull frames of really young brood. That brood I told you had to have to make a split from a colony that you have that you think is superior. And you can put it in one of these nukes and let them raise queens from that. And you can change the genetics of your colony. So here's some split basics, okay? In general, you want to use overwintered colonies. You try not to use first-year colonies. They haven't built up usually very much. They don't have the resources. They don't have the bees. Try to use one of those colonies that's overwintered because it does have the resources. In a way, it's kind of your survivor stock, if you want to call it that. Split strong colonies. Now, this is a really arguable comment. Michael Palmer would tell you that's the stupidest thing you could ever do, even though it's the tried and true. I don't know if it's tried, and I don't even know if it's true, but knowledge that you read about in books all the time. His argument would be, why in the heck would you take a big, strong colony that's not swarming at least, and break it into a bunch of little weaker colonies? You know, he would say, take the weaker colonies and build those up and then split those, but don't tear down your best producing colonies. If you're planning on having your colony raise a queen, they have to have the ability to do it. Okay. And that means you have to give them the resources. So they need eggs, they need young larvae, they need the nurse bees. We talked about that. There needs to be drones flying around. You know, a month or so ago, people were getting all excited and want to split their hives. And it's like, oh my God, you know, Julia pointed out, this isn't the time of year when you really have many drones. So you can raise as many queens as you want, but if there aren't any drones for them to go out and mate with, forget about it. It's a waste of time. When you're making up splits, keep the architecture of the nest the same or normal. You know, don't divide up or split up your brood with empty comb or foundation or drawn comb. And when you make them, protect from robbing. These are small, they're kind of weak colonies, so maybe use a robbing screen or move them to an out yard where they're not likely to get robbed, and add nurse bees and feed them as necessary. So those are kind of the basics. You know, that's kind of basic beekeeping, isn't it? It's just kind of common sense. Be aware that splits don't always work. It's okay, you know. Don't be afraid to try these and fail. In nature, only 20% of swarms are successful. That's pretty dismal when you think about it. So just because you lose a few splits or they don't meet your expectations, don't feel like a failure. Keep working at it. Try to find a system that works for you. There's lots of different ways to make splits, and some work for you and some won't. There's different splits or divides or nukes that you can make. And so if we just kind of generally look at the different kinds, if we want to make some for increased colonies or we want to replace those winter losses, a great time to do it is in the next month, April. Okay. By then we have queens that we can purchase and we can give them queens. So once we make up that nuke, they're going to start laying eggs, and resources are just beginning to come online and expand. All right. So they're going to become more and more available, which is just ideal for a young colony to collect and grow. Certainly for swarm control, the next few weeks, we want to be on top of that. Okay. We want to make those splits before the major nectar flow. We can make it during the nectar flow as well. But again, the swarming starts to peak before the major nectar flows. And we want to make these splits before the swarms happen. So keep in mind there's a rough time schedule that the next month or so is going to be an ideal time. As some people have pointed out, this year we might be a little bit early, but if you're watching your hives and you're seeing the signs like the white wax, the drone development, the increase in population, the queen cups, then you might want to move a little quicker. Just outright queen production or resource colonies, you can do that anytime during the summer. Okay, probably at least up through the middle or late July. And for overwintering nukes, these are the nukes that you're going to produce later in the summer. You want them to grow into 6 to 8 frame colonies. So like a nuke, a little 5-frame nuke box with a 5-frame super on top of it. Put those together in summer. The first splits I ever made, the first nukes I ever made, I was afraid to do it. Brad Woodward gave a lecture at our August meeting. And so I thought, I'm going to do this. And I called him up the next day and said, hey, Brad, you think this will work? He said, well, I don't know, give it a try. And those colonies just boomed. I mean, they were just incredibly big come the next fall, because these nukes just really grow quickly. What are you going to put in an ideal nucleus? Okay. And you can kind of look at this and go, that's pretty basic. I can do that. You know, ideally, you're going to give them a mated queen. Okay. That, if you're not, you're going to have to tweak this formula a little bit. And I'll tell you where a little bit down the line. But in general, just a basic nucleus. Again, anybody can do this. 2 or 3 frames of primarily capped brood, or has a little bit of emerging brood on it. If you're not sure, scratch open some of the cells on the comb and see if you look like you have a bee about ready to emerge or not. Make sure they have a frame of pollen and honey. And nurse bees tend to like uncapped honey better than capped honey. Give them a frame of just drawn comb on one of the edges. And then you're going to shake in 2 or 3 frames of nurse bees. Okay. That is just, a potato could do this, folks. You know, all of us can do it. It's easy. I guess the question is, can you shake too many bees in? And you probably wouldn't, but you could. If you get it too packed with bees, you know, you're going to push into more of like a congestion swarm type situation. But 2 or 3 frames of nurse bees, and then add more if you're watching them and it doesn't seem like you have enough. But pretty simple to put together a nucleus colony. So there's all kinds of different divides and splits. Okay. If you can imagine it, somebody's tried it. You know, there's as many different ways of splitting a nuke or dividing the colony as there are beekeepers. So if I tell you something tonight, you're going to go, oh, I don't do it that way. And you wouldn't be wrong, and I wouldn't be wrong. There's just a lot of different ways to do it. You need to kind of think of the reason you're doing it, what you're going to use them for, the time of the year, what kind of equipment you have on hand. You know, do you want increases or not? You might not want more bees, but you might have to split your colony because of swarming. Well, then just recombine it. So it all depends on your goals. So let's just kind of make a real simple split. This is the simplest split. So here you have a colony that's double deeps, okay? It's large, it's balanced, it's queen right. It's showing those early signs of potential swarming. And I'm seeing queen cups in it, a lot of white wax. I get so many bees, they don't seem like they can all fit in the hive. And it's just one that I'm leery of. I want to weaken it a little bit and see if I can prevent it from swarming. Okay, so all I need in this particular instance is another bottom board, an inner and outer cover, a couple of supers. I don't even need to locate the queen in this case, and that makes it even easier. And I am going to have to provide a queen for one of the colonies I generate from the split. So here you go. I've just simply divided them. Both colonies are relatively well balanced. Okay, they have brood, they have eggs, they have lots of bees and nurse bees, lots of resources, but only one of them has a queen. Okay, which one? We don't know, right? We don't know. So we're going to have to wait a couple days, 3 days. We're going to come back and look for eggs. Why 3 days? Well, in general, an egg is only an egg for 3 days, and then it decloses becomes a larvae. So the queen right colony is still going to have eggs. The one that doesn't have any eggs is the one I need to provide a queen to, okay? Or let them raise a queen. You can give them a mated queen, a queen cell, a virgin queen, whatever you want to do, or you can let them raise a queen. In this situation, they probably could raise a pretty reasonable queen because they're a pretty large colony. Any questions on that? And then I'm going to come back and give them each a super. and hopefully they won't swarm and they'll continue to grow. So any questions on that?
I got one. So would you do that in the same spot, or would you do your split in another location?
That's a good point. Some people will, you can do either one. You mean, are you asking, should I move it away? Move one of them away?
Yes.
You can do either or. You know, you can put these pretty close together and see if how the populations balance out. Generally speaking, the foragers are probably going to favor the colony with the queen just because of the odor, the queen pheromones. You can also switch places with these if you need to. If you find that this one's getting really populated and this one tends to be losing population or doesn't have what you want, you could swap places with those. All the foragers that are used to coming to this side will come back to now the weaker colony. Or after you do this, you can move them away, and then they're all going to have to reorient, and you're not going to have the problem. You know, if you get even close, if you can get close to making a split or a nucleus colony within a minute, you know, the bees are going to more than likely come in and fix your little mistakes. But if you're way off, you know, it's just not going to happen for you. Somebody had a question.
Do you feed when you make your splits, or is it only if there's not a nectar flow?
Do I feed?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A colony, like in this example, you know, they probably have quite a bit of stored honey on the sides. And so they, in general, would do okay. These bigger colonies aren't so much a problem. They have big foraging or big populations of foragers, so they're going to bring stuff in. The ones you got to worry about are the ones that aren't very big, the ones that don't have a big population of foragers until those young bees graduate to that job in the colony. And those smaller colonies, yeah, I would feed or give them honey.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else?
I had a question, John.
Yeah.
When you put the when you put the super on the nuke, what is in that super? Is it drawn out comb, or is it filled with pollen? Does it have nectar, or is it just plain frames?
Well, these could be drawn out comb, or they could be a combination of foundation and drawn out comb.
Okay. Could you,
You
if you didn't
could-
have any drawn out comb, like somebody who's a new beekeeper might not have the second year enough to make a
Yeah,
lot.
then you're gonna have to give them foundation or your foundation and a starter strip, you know, but feed them, you know, wax. Bees need nectar, you know, carbohydrates to draw wax.
Right.
Okay, so yeah, if that's your situation, go ahead and feed them.
So then in this configuration, this photograph that you're showing us, you would have a third box with a feeder in it? Or where would you put the feeder?
Oh yeah. If you're going to feed them, I always feed them in an enclosed box.
Okay, so I'm just making sure that it's clear.
Yeah. You could have one of those in-hive feeders, those division feeder type things.
Right.
If you want to use that, I always use paint cans inside a, empty box with the top on it.
Thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, colony like this, you probably don't need to worry too much about robbing because they're pretty big colonies to start with.
John, I've got a question, and maybe you'll get to this later. We can save for the end, but you have a pretty robust hive coming out of the winter, and you're worried about them swarming, but we don't have queens yet, and it's not going to be until the middle of April before we can secure queens. What are our options for splitting? Because you mentioned something about
They're-
see if they can raise their own queen, but we're seeing some
They're-
drones, but it's still early.
Yeah, it's pretty grim, and you're almost having to order them from Hawaii. Last year. Yeah, last year it was February. I went checked my hives, and they didn't have much in the way of resources. So I thought I better feed these guys. So I've told this story before. So I gave everybody a gallon of 1-to-1 syrup, and they took it all down. And then I kept watching them. So now we're like this time of year, first part of March, and it's like to go into those colonies. And that box that I had the paint can in was so full of bees, you couldn't hardly see the paint can.
Yeah.
I just pushed those colonies by feeding them, and I'd learned something about, along the way. I screwed up my colonies for most of the summer because they all were going to swarm, and I didn't have any way to split them down, and I didn't have any queens to give them, and there weren't any drones. So it was like, I kind of,
Yeah.
I made
that's
a
gonna
big
happen to
mistake.
me.
But I learned, that if I want to make a bunch of splits, I wouldn't feed them in February. I'd start feeding them in the next week. And then come the 1st of April, these are all going to be booming hives with lots of bees, and I can get queens and make my splits right then and there. But
Okay. Thanks.
yeah, that's a problem, Mary. It's going to be a problem, I think, this year too, especially with the drought, everything. We're going to hit spring a lot earlier, and we're going to have a lot more swarming problems.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so excuse me, this is just to give you an idea how long it takes for a mated queen to before you see any brood emerging. Okay, so with a mated queen, 21 days, right? After she starts laying eggs. Well, you're gonna put her in the hive, she's ready to go. The virgin queen is gonna take a little bit longer. She's probably already hatched out. She's in a cage, or you let her out. She hasn't mated yet. Remember, I told you it's going to take another week or two before she's ready to go. And if you have to raise a queen, it's 51 days. Look how much longer it takes if you let a colony raise a queen. And some of these smaller colonies, again, may not have the highest quality of queen. So just keep that in mind. You're not wrong if you let a colony raise its own queen. You're not wrong at all. I don't want to give you that impression. I just want you to have realistic expectations that it might look like that colony is just dead for a long time, and before you start to see a lot of bees flying around. So let's kind of talk a little bit about swarm control splits. Another example, really a large colony, but this one I have some, we're seeing some queen cells. Okay. So one of the things we can do is create an artificial swarm. Okay. Kind of a controlled split of a colony ready to swarm. And again, what we want to try and do with an artificial swarm, and let me back up and say, there's a million ways to do artificial swarms. So this is just one way, and you may have 3 different ways you want to do it, and I have a couple different ways I would do it. This is just one way to do it. Okay. So the idea between an artificial swarm is to create a swarm-like condition. Well, what's a swarm-like condition? What do we know about swarms? We know that when the queen cells cap, the queen leaves and she takes about 60 to 70% of all the bees with her. Boom. And so they leave a colony behind that only has a bunch of young bees, nurse bees, a few flying bees, but all the flying bees, they're gone. Boom. Okay, so what we're going to do is try to create 2 colonies, one which is the swarm, and one is more the parent colony type of situation. In this process, we need to find a queen. Okay, that can be the hard part, but so far we have some queen cells probably, but they haven't swarmed yet. One of the colonies after we make this split is going to have a queen, the other one is not. So we're going to have to give them a queen or the ability to make one if that's the route we're going to go. So here we go again. This is the same hive, but configured a little differently. So we got a big colony. We're starting to see, if I break it up, the bottom over here on the left is what we would see on the bottom part of the bottom box. So it's kind of configured this way. We have some cap brood in the middle. We have the queen on that middle cell. So we found her. We kind of know where she is. We're going to pull her out and put her in a different box. The top box looks like this. It's like, wow, we've got all this cap brood. And I probably should have put some emerging brood too with it, but we have uncapped queen cells. Why is it significant that we have, or I'm telling you, we have uncapped queen cells? Janine, I haven't picked on you yet. She's probably sleeping. No, somebody tell me.
What did you ask?
I asked why what's the significance of noting that these queen cells are uncapped?
Well, they're going to take longer to develop, and they need to be fed by a lot of nurse bees. So you need to have a large population to feed a really, a queen that's developing as a larvae.
Okay. Okay, so what I
They're
was
also
getting,
a little bit more fragile, but
I'm not worried about the fragility of these things. What I'm trying to really get to, keep it simpler than that, is we have a queen still in this colony that we broke. We separated 2 boxes. We had a queen. We found the queen. We would also expect there to be uncapped cells, right? Because I told you earlier that once cells cap, what happens?
They're gone.
They're gone. Adios, right?
you're talking about getting rid of those queen cells. Okay.
No, I'm not. I haven't gotten rid of anything yet. Okay, I just broke that colony down, and oh my God, this is what I found. I saw the queen down here, and I looked at this top box, and I have all these uncapped queen cells. So I know they're going to swarm, right? They're queen cells. They're not queen cups. So this is going to swarm if I don't do something. So I've decided to make an artificial swarm.
Leave 2.
What?
I said in your split, if you're just going to use the uncapped ones, leave 2.
Okay, I like that. So this is what I've done for my 1 box. Remember, when a colony swarms, you have the queen and all the flying bees. So basically, I'm going to put that frame that had some emerging and cap brood on it with the queen in a box by itself. And then I'm going to give them a frame of honey and pollen. And the rest of it's just drawn or foundation. That's the new colony. That effectively mirrors what they would have if they flew into a big old rotten tree and they have this big space. There's just the queen and the flying bees. The other part of the colony, the rest of the frames, I'm going to break down this way. I'm going to destroy almost all of the capped queen cells, and I'm going to keep 1 or 2. So I have all this capped brood that's emerging, some open brood still. I've given them honey and pollen and some room, some space. And then I'm going to see if they will, if this queen will develop, and keep monitoring them. And this colony should grow fine. If I wanted to, I could destroy all the queen cells, but I'm going to have to give them, make sure they have open brood, young open brood. Remember that 12 to 24-hour larvae that they can make a new queen from. Or I could bring in a frame of open brood from a another colony that's maybe less swarmy, maybe has better genetics, maybe it's a better producer. So you've got all these different avenues you can take when you're doing these splits. You just don't want to get focused in on the ideal split. Boom, that's all there is. You can play around with these things and come up with all different kind of creations, and they all generally work. So there's all kinds of options, all right? So now we're going to talk a little bit about nucleus hives. You know, this split, we're splitting these down into smaller colonies, 5 frames. And usually, in general, anyway, when we're talking about splits, we're talking about making up nucleus colonies. When somebody tells me, oh, I'm going to make some splits, this is what I assume they're doing, but I don't know. So the ideal split, again, a mated queen is preferred. We're going to put 2 to 3 frames of primarily capped and maybe a little bit of emerging brood. Okay, this is a real simple thing to do. We're going to try to give them an adequate food store. So maybe we'll give them a frame of pollen, a frame of honey, depends on how many frames of brood we're putting in there. Then we might give them 1 frame of drawn comb. And we're going to shake in 2 to 3 frames of nurse bees. Remember, I asked you this early, can you do too many? You can, but generally don't. Nucleus colonies, in the terms of queens, you're going to either have come as 2 types. You're either going to have a colony that you have to give a queen or some form of a queen to, or you're going to have to let them raise their own. There's no in between. Okay, so you need to have in your head what you're going to do here and why you're going to do it, and if you have the resources to do it, the time to do it. Pretty simple. Not a lot of choices there, A or B. So here's your simple 5 frame nuke. 2 to 3 frames of emerging cap brood. It's over and over. It's the same thing, right? No frames of eggs, or if they're going to make queens, then you have to give them a frame with eggs, frames with food, nectar, and uncapped honey and pollens, and then fill the rest of the box with drawn comb. Very simple. Okay. So what would that basically look like? This is the order of frames from one side to the other. So on the outside, let's say you're going to put the food frame. That could be pollen, it could be uncapped honey. That could be both. Ideally, you can find a frame that kind of has honey on one side and pollen packed on the other. Then you're going to put your capped and emerging brood frame in, another capped and emerging brood frame, maybe an open drawn comb, and maybe an uncapped food frame again. Okay, depends on how many frames you're putting in there a brood, and if you really needed any drawn comb. I would be more inclined to make sure they have enough food than have space, because I know as this brood emerges, they're going to gain space, and then I can add space later on if I need to. Shake some bees. Okay, but we got to give them a queen. Remember, where are we going to put it? We want to put it between the 2 frames of emerging brood. Why? Because as nurse bees are hatching out, they're going to take care of that queen and feed it. And if it's a queen cell, they're going to take care of it. Well, that's kind of the situation when you're giving them a queen. Okay, not raising a queen. Raising a queen, you're giving them a queen. It's going to look like this. I did these on the dining room table today, and my wife was real happy about it. But so you got your honey, your cap brood in the middle. You got the queen cage, the pollen, some drawn comb, and that ought to work. You get even close to that, the bees are going to take care of you. What if you're requiring them to raise a queen? Okay, now you have to be a little more careful, and you have to make sure that they have enough emerging brood, young nurse bees, and the ability to raise the queen. And that goes to having drones available, good nutrition, a frame with eggs, 12 to 24-hour larvae. If it's not, the larvae isn't there, the eggs will become the larvae. And again, that's a chance to change your genetics. If you don't like what you have and you want to change it, introduce a frame from another colony that has eggs and very young larvae and let them raise the queen. Again, I want to kind of emphasize the point. They can raise queens, but small colonies don't raise the best queens. That just doesn't, they just don't have the resources. They don't have the nurse bees. They don't have enough royal jelly. It's just harder to do that. And oftentimes when they do, you find that they supersede that queen relatively soon. So here's one that's going to be raising its own queen. And the main difference is we're giving them a frame with eggs and young larvae. If we're going to make overwintering nukes, we go through the same process, and we're going to again make these later in the summer, August, July, after the solstice. Everything is a good time to start doing this stuff. And our goal here would make an overwintering nuke. We use the same process, but we're going to try to build them up faster. We want a bigger colony going into winter, and so we can use a bigger nuke box, or we can build these up so we have 6 to 8 frames of brood by using 5-frame supers on top of your regular 5-frame nuke box. And I mentioned that I started in August when I did it, so I'm not afraid to do that here. And we can push the colonies by feeding them. You just feed these things. They think there's a big nectar flow. They raise a lot of brood. These can become incredibly strong. You should be able to go into winter. And by what I mean by that is, you close up your hive. I close up my hives into October, and I don't go back into them until about now. And those things will come out in the springtime and just raring to go, just really packed. And if you're not careful, these will swarm on you, and they'll swarm really fast. So I'm going to wrap this up. First, splits and divides and nucleus colonies. God, just the terminology intimidates the hell out of most people. It did me. I waited almost 2 years to try it. Then I talked to a guy in one of our classes. He told me, he split all his first year colonies like 3 times. He had 30 some colonies, and it was like, oh, geez, if you can do that, I probably can do it. I found, and I think it is fairly easy and simple to accomplish. If you just kind of use those basic formulas, you're going to do okay. Depending on what you're doing, you might have to acquire some extra equipment, and sometimes it's specialized. For my case, I like to use those snow grow boards and put a colony on top of another colony, but keep it separated by the snow grow board. They're easy to build. If you had to buy them, I'm not sure what they would cost. But splits can save you a lot of money. They can make you a lot of money. You can sell these little nucleus colonies for a pretty good amount of money every year, and it seems like you can sell them all season long. And definitely you can replace your annual losses each year, and you should plan on at least making some nucleus colonies in the sense of planning ahead so you can replace the losses. So bottom line is propagate, propagate, propagate. So any questions?
I have a question. I was wondering if you have a colony and you're trying to have them raise their own queen with a queen cell, but you used a queen cell that's not yet capped, will they abandon that queen cell in favor of making an emergency queen?
I haven't tried that before. I think if they were pretty hopelessly queenless, they would continue taking care of that cell. But I don't actually know the answer to that. Maybe somebody else does.
Maybe I'll find out this year and let you know.
Okay.
John, what do you think about what I did my second year? I couldn't get any queens till the middle of April. So starting in March, every 5 days I went to every frame and got every queen cup and every swarm's queen cell that I could get. And it didn't swarm but every 5 days had to go to every frame. Hopefully they didn't, sometimes they hide them pretty good. So that's not actually the best way of doing it, but that's the only way you can prevent, I think, a swarm if they, if you want to get queens.
No, Henry, it is a way of doing it. It wouldn't work for for me and my lifestyle. But if you wanted to go through your colonies every 5 days and do that, it will work. And eventually, you'll probably win, and they'll go off the urge to swarm and just decide to collect a lot of nectar. So, I'd say it's not a great idea, but under your circumstances, it's the only thing you could do, right?
I was thinking about before you get queens.
Yeah.
You get, because I done it. I mean, it's labor intensive.
Yeah. I couldn't do it in my lifestyle. I just wouldn't have time to do that. But it is like I said, there's lots of different ways, and that's one of them.
Well, Hank has a tent right next to his beehive, so
Yeah.
no problem.
Needless to say, people were wondering how come I was so worried every 5 days. I said, I don't want them to swarm in my neighborhood. And then, so
Yeah.
I learned the hard way, I guess.
Well, it's kind of the same situation I had when I boosted all those colonies by feeding them. But it was, I just got myself into a jam, and I knew they were going to swarm, and I knew I should split them, but I knew there weren't any drones. I mean, I was just, what did I learn? Not to do it so early. Cost me.
I might do an experiment where I pull some young bee eggs and uncapped brood into a nuke and just see if they do anything. And see if they pull out any queen cell, draw out a queen cell. See what happens. Just got bees to spare. John,
You're gonna take them to Blue Lake or what? Fortuna? Willow Creek?
What's that, Janine?
I'm just wondering when are you going to do this, Mary?
This weekend.
And then where are you going to take them someplace warm where there's lots of drones?
I have lots of drones here.
We do?
Yeah.
You think it's warm enough?
I know it's not warm enough, but they're going to swarm. I just know it. John, I use only medium boxes. And so the nukes that I would want to use would be medium nukes. But I don't know if those are big enough to overwinter or to hold long-term even. Do you have any thoughts on medium nukes?
I only use medium boxes, and all my nukes are mediums, and they do just fine. And so maybe you have to be a little bit more careful about adding a few more nurse bees, shake another frame of bees in periodically. You need to be a little more on top of what they're eating. Do they have enough food? But I have deeps, and I've used some deeps, but I just prefer mediums now. And they'll work fine. And I had the same question when I started doing that, and Michael Palmer was online on one of the chat rooms, and I said, hey, what do you think about the mediums? Because that's all I use. He said they'll work fine. So I was fine after that.
Yeah, I've had 5-frame nukes over winter just fine. As long as you make sure that you feed them and are attentive and give them space when they need it. They usually grow.
Oh, they grow fast. I mean, they really can grow quick.
John, how many days before you get queens do you make your splits? Like, what's your preference?
I really don't have a time frame. If I have queens, I'm going to put them in. If I make them, I'm going to put them in. I'm not going to release them. I'm going to keep them wrapped in tape. Okay, because if I make that split and there's an egg or a young larvae, they're going to draw a queen cell from that, and they're not going to accept my queen probably. So I'm going to put my queen in her cage queen in that cell, in that nuke. And I'm going to go back in 3 days, I'm going to see if they've drawn any queen cells. If I did it right, there shouldn't be any eggs in there, but if I missed one, likely they'll draw it out. So I'm going to go back in 3 days. I'm going to check if there are any. I'm going to destroy them all, and I'm still not going to release my queen. I'll go back 2 days later, and then there shouldn't be any queens. All the eggs that would have been in there when I made up that nuke will now be larvae too old to make a queen from. And then
I get that part, but I was wondering if you make your nukes before you get your queens, like
No.
Okay.
I make my nukes after I get my queens.
Okay.
You can make all your nukes ahead of time so they're queenless for a day or two, and then get your queens and put them in. I've just never been that organized.
I think it's
Yeah.
good to weather watch before the queens arrive and make your nukes on a nice day.
Yeah, that's a good point. You should make up your nukes kind of on a good day, kind of midday. That way all the foragers are out and you're not stumbling over a lot of bees. And then once they're made, when you come back, you're out of the way and they're going to go into the colony you have set up for them to go into.
But it's important to cut out all the queen cells when you make the nukes up in advance before adding the queens.
All right, is there any more questions about this topic?
I have another question if I can do a twofer.
Yeah.
What was it? Shoot, doggone it. Give me a second. Will a colony, when you do a split and a colony is waiting to make their own queen, will they draw comb before the queen emerges and while they're waiting for the queen to mature, or do they put a stop to comb building?
They stop.
So I'm not clear on your question, Angela.
Will they draw comb while they're waiting for the queen to emerge and or mature, mate,
Yeah.
basically?
They should continue on as a normal colony, should be continuing on.
In my experience, they don't build while they're
Slow
waiting
down.
for a queen.
Thank you.
I want to hear back on everybody's splits in a few meetings and see how it all went,
Okay.
so we can compare notes.
Yeah, are you, Eric, do you want to find out how many people want queens? And,
I don't think I want to on this platform.
oh, okay.
A little too chaotic, but yeah, it looks like middle of April is their kind of window right now for queens. Talking
Eric,
about
are you sending
honeybee
out an
genetics.
email? Eric, are you sending out an email, or do we all just need to go to the,
Oh no, I'll send out an email.
okay.
Yeah, a lot of people aren't on Facebook.
Okay, that would be
Yeah.
fine. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John.
Thanks. Thank you, John.
That was awesome.
Welcome.
Yay.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.